I once thought losing my father was the greatest tragedy of my life, until I learned he didn't die from illness. My stepmother poisoned him slowly, and my brother, he finished the job from the shadows. They didn't just steal his fortune, they stole the truth. They nearly killed me when I started digging, but I came back from the dead, holding the original will they tried to burn, and when my stepmother saw me alive, all she said was, "You should have died on that bridge. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong." Hit subscribe now before we reveal the film of this brutal truth. Rain fell like sheets of glass as Evelyn Grace turned off the highway, steering her car onto the narrow road that led to the house she once called home. Her knuckles whitened against the steering wheel every mile, pulling her deeper into a place she swore she'd never return to. The trees pressed in like silent sentries, their branches clawing at the sky. She knew the turn well. Even after all these years, her body remembered the route her heart tried to forget. The iron gates stood open when she arrived, not out of welcome, she knew, more like indifference. She drove through them slowly, the gravel crunching beneath the tires louder than it should have been, like a warning. The house loomed ahead, sharp and silent against the storm-gray sky. Once it had been white alive with the scent of her father's pipe tobacco and the echoes of his laughter. Now it looked like a mausoleum. Windows like shuttered eyes, doors like sealed lips. The house that raised her, the house that betrayed her. She parked but didn't kill the engine. For a moment she sat there gripping the wheel, listening to the hum of the car, a sound she could control, unlike what waited inside. Her reflection in the windshield caught her off guard. Older, colder. Not the girl who ran barefoot through these hallways. She was someone else now, someone the people inside wouldn't recognize. She wasn't sure if that hurt or helped. She shut off the engine. Silence. It felt heavier than the rain. Evelyn stepped out her boots, sinking slightly into the wet gravel. She pulled her coat tighter, not against the weather, but against the chill under her skin. Each step toward the house felt slower than the last, like her body was resisting the past her mind demanded she face. At the front door, no one greeted her. Of course not. She pushed it open herself. Inside, the air was heavier, stale. She half expected the scent of lilies, her father's favorite, but instead, there was only dust and the faint tang of furniture polish. And then she heard it. Laughter. Light, feminine. It cut sharper than any silence. Evelyn followed the sound to the grand hall where the funeral service was already winding down. People in black scattered in polite clusters, sipping wine, whispering the same rehearsed condolences. No grief here, just performance. At the center stood Allison, perfect as ever, her mother in name only. She wore black, but her smile was the color of victory. Allison's hair swept over one shoulder, her pearl necklace catching the light. No sign of tears. Her makeup flawless. Evelyn's stomach twisted. Beside her, Thomas lounged like he owned the room, which Evelyn realized bitterly he did now. Same arrogant smirk, same air of entitlement. The boy her father once called Second Chance had become the man who took everything. Evelyn's footsteps faltered. She didn't belong here. Thomas caught her eye then. His smirk widened. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Evelyn forced herself forward past faces she barely remembered, past strangers pretending to care. The conversations hushed as she moved through them, like a shadow. At the front, Allison finally turned. Her smile was polite, cold. Evelyn. Just her name. No warmth. No, I'm sorry for your loss. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer her hand. Evelyn spoke first. Where is he? Her voice cracked, hating how small she sounded. Allison gestured lazily toward the closed doors of the east parlor. Casket's in there, but the service is over. Evelyn flinched. But Allison wasn't done. We didn't think you'd come. I didn't think I'd need an invitation. Thomas laughed. Quiet, cruel. Allison's gaze flicked toward him, then back to Evelyn. We handled everything. It's been exhausting. Evelyn wanted to scream. You handled burying him? You handled the man who raised me. She clenched her fists instead. And then came the words she wasn't ready for. All formalities are finished, Allison said smoothly. Including the will. Evelyn froze. What? Father's will? Allison's tone was casual, almost bored. It's been read. Handled. Evelyn felt her pulse hammer in her throat. No? Thomas stepped closer now, his voice dripping with condescension. Sorry, sis. Guess nobody told you. He leaned in. Dad didn't leave you anything. The words struck harder than Evelyn expected. She staggered back a step. Allison's expression didn't change. Don't make a scene. Her voice smooth as glass. Evelyn's vision blurred. She wasn't sure if it was from anger or grief anymore. But that's impossible. Her father would never. Thomas cut her off with a shrug. He changed it before he died. Allison confirmed it, her tone matter of fact. A few months ago, he wanted Thomas to handle the estate. Said you were unreliable. The lie hit deeper than the truth. She heard herself whisper, I was his daughter. Allison tilted her head. Were you? That shattered something. Behind her eyes, behind her ribs, behind years of silence she mistook for strength. And then the voice came, not from Allison, not from Thomas, from herself. A voice Evelyn didn't recognize, a voice that felt like steel. In her mind, in the air. They didn't just kill him, the voice said. They killed what he meant to me. And then Evelyn realized it wasn't her speaking aloud. It was her father's voice inside her, the one they thought was buried. But Evelyn! She was still listening. The house hadn't changed, but Evelyn knew better than to believe in surfaces. 3 days. That's how long it took before she found the first crack. It happened by accident. She wasn't searching for evidence. Not yet. Not officially. She was just searching for space to breathe. The library her father once called his sanctuary now stood hollow cold as the marble floor. Shelves still held his books, but not his presence. And yet something felt wrong. On instinct, Evelyn moved to the far cabinet, the one locked in her childhood. Her father's private files. She'd never been allowed near it. But now it stood slightly ajar, like someone had been there, like someone forgot to finish the lie. Inside, she found a folder stamped with her own name, and her blood ran cold. Inside weren't family photos, not letters, not memories. They were court documents, legal papers filed 3 years ago, a lawsuit against her. Evelyn sank to the floor, the folder trembling in her hands as she flipped page after page. Allegations of theft, accusations of fraud, claims she'd stolen from the family business, her father's business. Her signature, her forged signature. She couldn't breathe. Someone had filed a lawsuit in her name against her life. A narrative constructed, a future rewritten behind her back. But why? And then the real question, the darker one, the answer came sooner than she expected. Footsteps. Deliberate. She looked up just as Thomas leaned lazily against the doorway, arms crossed, smirk sharp as glass. I see you found it. Evelyn's throat tightened. You. Thomas shrugged, walking forward without urgency. Allison's idea, actually. I just signed where I was told. He crouched in front of her like a predator humoring a cornered animal. You know what your problem is, Eve? You believe Dad's silence meant protection. His grin widened. It meant replacement. Evelyn's hands balled into fists, but her body stayed frozen. Thomas tilted his head, studying her. You're not family anymore. His voice was softer now, crueler. You're just the part he forgot to delete. Evelyn didn't remember standing up. Didn't remember her voice cutting through the suffocating air between them. But suddenly it was there. Why? Thomas didn't blink. Because you lost. And then he left. Simple. Final. Evelyn stood alone, the folder still clutched in her shaking hands as the silence swallowed her whole. But her father's voice buried, but breathing whispered something else. Find Graham. Evelyn didn't trust many people. Not anymore. But Graham wasn't people. He was loyalty wearing human skin. Her father's lawyer. His confidant. The man who taught her chess before she learned contracts. And the only man her father had trusted with everything until Allison forced him into early retirement. She found him 2 towns over. Not in some grand office, but in a dusty back room above a bookstore. He didn't look surprised to see her. I knew you'd come. Graham's voice was raspier than she remembered. Time had frayed its edges, but not its resolve. Evelyn dropped the forged lawsuit papers onto his desk without a word. He skimmed the first page, paused, and then met her eyes. They finally showed you. Evelyn didn't understand. I found them. No. Graham leaned back. They left them. Confusion tangled with anger inside her. Why would they want me to see this? Because it's already done. Evelyn's pulse quickened. I don't understand. Graham's voice lowered. 3 years ago, Allison told your father you'd stolen from the business. She showed him falsified reports, financial discrepancies she created. At the same time, she filed a private lawsuit, one your father never saw. He pushed the papers back toward her like they were poison. The purpose wasn't to win, Evelyn whispered. It was to disinherit me. Graham nodded. Public accusations would have triggered scrutiny. But a quiet legal claim buried just deep enough, it let her remove you from the family trust. Evelyn staggered back. But Dad, your father never knew. Graham hesitated like the next words were daggers he didn't want to throw. He thought you'd abandoned him. The world spun. All the missed calls, all the unanswered letters, all the silences she couldn't explain. They told him I left. Her voice cracked. Graham said nothing. He didn't need to. She saw the truth in his eyes, and for the first time Evelyn understood. She hadn't lost her father. She'd been stolen from him, bit by bit, lie by lie. And now, standing in the dust of Graham's forgotten office, Evelyn made a choice. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't break. Not here. Not now. What do I do? Her voice was steel. Graham studied her, not as the little girl he once knew, but as the woman she'd become. You dig. For what? He didn't smile. The truth. Evelyn picked up the forged lawsuit again. This time her hands didn't shake. Thomas said she wasn't family anymore. Allison said she'd lost. But they forgot something. Evelyn wasn't here to reclaim a family. She was here to bury the traitors inside it. Rain tapped steadily against the office window as Graham sat motionless, staring down at the papers between them like they were a body he couldn't save. Evelyn watched him, feeling the clock inside her chest wind tighter with every second of silence. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't crack, but it came close. Your father suspected. The words hit harder than she expected. She didn't even know what she'd been expecting anymore. Suspected what? Graham looked up. His eyes, once so sharp, were clouded by something Evelyn couldn't name. That Allison was poisoning him. For a second, the world spun wrong. Evelyn's lungs forgot how to work. No, it wasn't a denial. It was disbelief begging for a lie. But Graham didn't lie. 3 months before his death, he said quietly, he came to me. Said something wasn't right. Fatigue, dizziness, memory lapses. He thought it was age at first, but then the bruises started. Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely hers. I never saw... Because he hid it. From everyone. Graham's expression hardened. Except Allison. Evelyn's stomach turned. She convinced him it was stress, that running the estate was killing him. She pushed him to retire. Step back from the business. She told him he needed rest. Graham's hand curled into a fist, and when he hesitated, she made sure I wasn't around to advise him. Evelyn blinked slow, terrified. I was dismissed. Officially. Your father signed the termination papers himself. That's impossible. I know. Evelyn stood pacing now, hands in her hair. She forged his signature. No. Graham's voice was worse than anger. She manipulated him into signing. Allison always played the long game. She made him believe stepping away from me was stepping toward peace. Evelyn's mind screamed, but no sound came. And the doctors, Graham shook his head. Private physicians, handpicked by her. Why didn't he say anything to me? Graham didn't answer. He didn't have to. She already knew. Because by the time her father suspected, he no longer trusted anyone, even his daughter. Silence choked the air between them. Evelyn spoke without thinking. What if he wasn't wrong? Graham looked at her. What if he was being poisoned? He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss her. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. Do you want proof? Evelyn's heart slammed against her ribs. Tell me what to do. That night, Evelyn stood in the rain outside her father's old study. The locks had changed. She broke them anyway. Inside, the air smelled stale. Heavy, like memory left to rot. She remembered this room. She remembered the sound of her father's voice echoing off these walls as he taught her how to read contracts before bedtime. Now only shadows answered her. She moved fast, her flashlight sweeping across shelves, cabinets, desk drawers. Nothing felt real. Nothing felt hers. Until she found it. A small, unmarked box, hidden beneath the floorboard near the fireplace. Her father's hiding place. Inside, she found prescription bottles. Half empty. No labels. No records. Just pills. Evelyn's hands trembled as she photographed everything. She didn't know what she was looking at, not yet, but she knew what it meant. Her father had doubted, and he'd kept his doubts secret. Because even at the end, he hadn't trusted his own wife. She moved to the desk, next flipping through old appointment logs, private journals, anything that felt untouched by Allison's hand. Page after page of meaningless notes until a name surfaced. Dr. Ellis. A physician Evelyn didn't recognize. She snapped photos of the contact details scribbled hastily in the margins. Her father had circled the name 3 times. A message. A clue. A lifeline. Before Allison severed it, morning bled into the estate as Evelyn sat in her father's empty office, staring at the photos glowing on her phone screen. Vials. Pills. A name. She'd come back here to bury her father. Now she was digging him up. And if Allison thought she'd won, Evelyn had only one response. This isn't over. Not even close. The first thing Evelyn heard when she stepped into the east corridor was the sound of paper burning. Not a fire crackling. Not wood. Paper. That sound was different. Sharper. Like someone erasing history. She didn't hesitate. She followed the smell of smoke down the hall, past the portraits of dead men who'd built the Grace estate until she found herself standing outside her father's old private office, the door half open. Inside, Allison stood before the marble fireplace, tossing page after page of documents into the flames. She wasn't frantic. She wasn't panicked. She was meticulous. Evelyn watched in silence, heart hammering against her ribs. Allison's movements were clinical, controlled. Like this wasn't the first time she'd done it. Like this wasn't desperation. It was strategy. And Evelyn knew with the clarity of a knife pressed against skin that whatever her stepmother was burning, it mattered. But she also knew this Allison didn't know she was watching. Not yet. Evelyn didn't step forward. She stepped back. She would not play Allison's game. Not this time. She had to make her own. 2 hours later, Evelyn sat alone in her car, rain streaking down the windshield in thin silver lines. Her pulse hadn't slowed. The image of Allison feeding documents to the flames was carved behind her eyes. She stared at her phone thumb hovering over the screen until her fear suffocated itself. She made the call. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered. Calm. Professional. Do you want digital or physical surveillance? Evelyn's voice didn't tremble. Both. Target. My brother. She hesitated, then corrected herself. Thomas Grace. Because family no longer meant protection. Family meant threat. The woman on the phone didn't ask questions. Standard rate applies. Updates twice daily. Do you require discretion? Evelyn's mouth twisted. Always. She hung up. And just like that, the game changed. Allison wanted to bury the past. Thomas wanted to erase her. But Evelyn was done hiding. That night, she broke into her father's storage vault. Not in secret. Not to hide. To find. Allison had burned whatever she could. But Evelyn knew her father better than that. He didn't trust anyone. Not even the woman he'd married. In the far end of the vault, behind boxes marked with company seals and tax ledgers, Evelyn found the lockbox. Small, unmarked, but heavy. She pried it open with a screwdriver, her hands steady in the cold. Inside, bottles, like the ones in his study. Same unlabeled pills, same silent warnings. But beneath the vials lay something new. A sealed envelope, her father's handwriting scrawled across the front. 3 words, do not trust. Her vision blurred, but she forced her fingers to tear the seal. Inside wasn't a letter. It wasn't instructions. It was a list. A list of appointments, dates, locations, people, doctors, lawyers, bankers, a roadmap of paranoia or proof. She didn't know yet, but Evelyn didn't care. She took photos of every page, every word, every name. Then, for the first time since she'd stepped foot back in the Grace estate, she smiled. Not from relief, not from victory, from purpose. Because now she had something Allison couldn't burn. A truth too dangerous to hide. A legacy too sharp to bury. Her father had tried to fight. He'd just died before he could finish. But Evelyn, she was still alive. And now she wasn't fighting for memory. She was fighting for war. And she wasn't going to lose. It started with a message. Short, casual, forgettable if Evelyn hadn't known better. Thomas, meet me at the old bridge. Noon. No more games. She should have known. She did know. But knowing and believing aren't always the same thing. By the time she arrived, the sky above the forest had bruised to gray clouds pressing low like a warning. The bridge stretched out over the ravine ahead, narrow and slick from the morning's rain. The wooden planks darkened to near black beneath the weight of the storm. Evelyn hesitated at the edge of the clearing. No sign of Thomas. No sound but the wind rattling leaves overhead. She glanced back toward the path she came from, wondering if this was the right choice. But choice was never the point. She stepped forward. The bridge creaked beneath her boots. Every instinct screamed to turn back. But fear was how they won. Halfway across, she saw him. Thomas. Standing at the far end, arms crossed like he'd been waiting forever. No smirk this time. No words. Just watching. Evelyn tightened her jaw, heart pounding. What is this? His voice was flat. Closure. Then the snap came. Not from Thomas. From below her. She looked down just as the planks beneath her boots shifted unnatural wrong. She felt the moment the bridge betrayed her. Not from age. Not from weather. From sabotage. And she understood. It wasn't just a message. It was a trap. The wood split. Her body fell. The scream never made it past her throat. Evelyn crashed through the broken boards, the world tumbling in shards of sky and river, her mind fracturing between impact and fear until the cold swallowed her whole. The river wasn't water. It was stone. It was fists. It was a grave. She fought to surface, gasping against currents too fast, too thick, hands clawing at nothing as the rapids dragged her further from the wreckage, from Thomas, from the life he just tried to erase. She didn't know how long she fought. Long enough to know no one was coming. Long enough to know Thomas wouldn't. Then everything went black. Back at the estate, Thomas didn't bother with theatrics. He walked straight through the door, dripping with river spray, his knuckles scraped but unshaken. Allison met him in this grand hall. She didn't ask if it was done. She asked how long until the police found the body. Thomas's reply was simple. They won't. And Allison, for the first time, smiled. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Something colder. Something that looked like certainty. Good. They didn't toast. They didn't celebrate. They simply moved on. Because in their world, Evelyn Grace was already dead. And dead daughters don't ask questions. The first knock came just after midnight. Soft. Steady. Impossible. Graham froze where he stood in the kitchen, his hand trembling slightly around the glass he hadn't drunk from. Rain clawed at the windows, wind rattling loose shutters, but that sound, that knock, didn't belong to the storm. Another knock. 3 times. Then silence. He crossed the dark hallway, breath shallow, every instinct telling him to turn back. But something older than fear pulled him forward. He opened the door, and she stood there. Evelyn, dripping river water across the marble, hair plastered to her cheeks, eyes darker than the storm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her voice brittle as glass. "Help me." He pulled her inside without asking. Minutes later, Evelyn sat wrapped in blankets by the fireplace, steam curling from her clothes, her skin pale, but breathing. Graham watched the way her hands shook, not from cold. Not anymore. From whatever kept her alive. "I saw the bridge," he said quietly. "On my way here." Evelyn didn't answer. "Who did it?" Still silence. Then her voice quieter, heavier. "Thomas." Graham's stomach turned, but he said nothing. He knew it wasn't a question. It was a sentence. Evelyn leaned forward, staring into the fire like it could burn her clean. Her voice, when it came, was steady. He didn't plan to miss. Graham studied her, heartbreaking and rebuilding all at once. "You should rest." But Evelyn turned to him, and what he saw in her eyes terrified him more than the near death he'd imagined. "Resolve." "I'm not resting." He hesitated. "Evelyn." She cut him off. Everything until now, that was defense. Her voice shifted. Colder. Sharper. "Now it's war." Graham felt something shift in the room. In her. She wasn't coming back from this. Not fully. "What do you need me to do?" he whispered. Evelyn met his gaze. For starters, she stood, and the firelight caught her soaked silhouette like an omen. "Tell Allison I'm dead." Allison sat in her study, swirling wine in a crystal glass, watching raindrops crawl down the windows like the last remnants of her conscience. She wasn't worried. She didn't doubt. Not Thomas. Not anymore. When the call came from Graham's personal line, she answered without hesitation. "What is it?" Graham's voice was flat. No anger. No sadness. Just confirmation. "She's gone." Allison's smile was slow. Satisfied. "Good." She ended the call without goodbye. The glass tilted. Red liquid caught the light. And somewhere in that silence she whispered to herself. Finally. Behind her the rain kept falling. But she didn't notice, because she thought the storm was over. She didn't know it was just beginning. And Evelyn Grace. She wasn't dead. She was waiting. In the dead hours before morning, Evelyn moved through the estate like a shadow. Not a ghost. Ghosts belonged to the dead. She was something worse. She didn't need Graham's warnings. She didn't need sleep. She needed proof. The old storage house behind the estate had once been her father's pride. A private vault where family records were archived, contracts signed, legacies recorded. It was the last place Allison would think to burn because Allison thought the past was already erased. But Evelyn knew better. The past doesn't die. It waits. The door wasn't locked. Allison's mistake. Or Thomas's arrogance. Either way, Evelyn pushed it open without hesitation. Inside, dust clung to the air like regret. She worked quickly. Flashlight clutched between her teeth, hands tearing through old crates, overturned ledgers, cracked folders. Nothing spoke. Nothing fought back. Then she found it. A lockbox. Small, heavy, burnt along the edges. Her pulse stuttered. She pried it open. Inside, layers of ash. She coughed, tears pricking her eyes as the soot coated her skin, but she didn't stop. She dug bare-handed through the blackened remains until her fingers closed around paper. Not whole, not untouched, but not gone. She pulled the fragments free, edges charred, corners crumbled, but ink still clung to the center. Signatures. Her father's handwriting. A date. A name. Her name. Tedichuk. The real will. They'd tried to burn it, but they'd failed. Evelyn sat down on the cold floor fragments spread around her like bones. She forced herself to breathe. Not panic, not hope, just breathe. Then she picked up her phone. "Graham!" His voice came thick with sleep. She didn't let him speak. "I found it." Silence. Then sharper. "Where?" "In the vault." Pause. "Condition." "Damaged." Another pause. "Bring it to me." "No." Evelyn's voice hardened. "I'm bringing you here." An hour later, Graham stood over the makeshift workspace Evelyn had built in her father's old office papers, spread out under LED lights, gloves on her hands, patience replacing fear. He said nothing. He just watched. Watched her work. Watched her focus. Watched the girl he once taught contracts become the woman restoring her father's legacy. It took hours. Piece by piece. Fragment by fragment. Some too burned to recover. Others half intact. But slowly, painfully, the document reassembled. Her father's signature, her inheritance, her proof. Evelyn leaned back, her body aching from hours hunched over the evidence, but her mind sharper than ever. We need to authenticate this. Graham nodded. I know someone. Quiet. Quieter than me. Evelyn looked up, her voice steel. Then get him. Graham paused before leaving. What's next? Evelyn didn't hesitate. They buried my father. She met his gaze. They're not burying me. He left, and Evelyn sat alone again. But not with fear, not with doubt, with proof. And this time, proof would kill faster than poison. It always did. The first thing Evelyn noticed when she stepped into the drawing room wasn't the silence. It was the waiting. Allison sat by the window, legs crossed, a glass of something dark and expensive balanced between manicured fingers. She didn't look up when Evelyn entered. She didn't need to. She already knew. Evelyn stood in the doorway, rainwater still drying against her skin, heart steady in her chest. She waited, counted the seconds, let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then Allison spoke. I heard you were dead. Evelyn didn't flinch. You sound disappointed. Finally, Allison looked at her and smiled. I'm not, just surprised. Evelyn stepped forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them one careful footfall at a time. Liar. The word cracked the air like a whip. Allison's smile didn't fade, but something colder settled in her eyes. You should have stayed gone. Evelyn ignored the invitation to fear. She kept walking. Closer. Close enough now to see the faint lines time hadn't spared Allison, no matter how many treatments, how many creams, how many lies. I found the will. Silence. Then Allison set down her glass. Evelyn watched her fingers. They didn't tremble. Not yet. You think that changes anything? Allison asked. Evelyn's voice was stone. I know it does. Another silence, longer this time. Then Allison leaned back in the chair like a queen bored with court proceedings. Do you want to know the difference between your father and me, Evelyn? Evelyn said nothing. Allison answered anyway. I did what he wouldn't. Her gaze sharpened, slicing through the air. I ended it. For a moment, Evelyn didn't understand. Then she did. You killed him! Allison's smile returned. Don't be melodramatic. You poisoned him. I helped him rest. The words were gentle. The horror wasn't. Evelyn's nails dug into her palms. You're admitting it. To you, you're not a judge, you're a ghost. Allison stood now, graceful as ever, moving past Evelyn like she wasn't there, like she'd already been erased. I gave him peace. Evelyn turned, tracking her every step. He trusted you. Allison stopped by the fireplace, running her finger along the mantel absently. No, Evelyn, he gave up on you. I was just the end. She looked back then, calm, certain, same as I'll be for you. Evelyn should have screamed, should have cried. Instead, she stepped forward and whispered, You're wrong. Allison arched an eyebrow. About what? Evelyn's voice didn't shake. You won't be the end of me. She crossed the final step. You'll be the example. Allison's lips parted, confused. Evelyn leaned in, her voice ice. Bà sẽ ra đi còn nhanh hơn. Then she left. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. Let Allison wonder. Let Allison fear. Because for the first time, Evelyn Grace wasn't running. She was hunting. The street was too quiet. Graham knew it the moment he stepped outside his apartment. For a man who'd lived long enough to recognize when death was waiting, silence wasn't peace. It was warning. He paused at the top of the steps, scanning the sidewalk beneath the flickering streetlights. Nothing. But he wasn't fooled. He adjusted the folder beneath his coat, the fragments of the will Evelyn had restored just hours earlier, and told himself to move. Fast. He'd only made it 10 feet before the first shadow peeled away from the alley. Thomas. Not a boy anymore. Not a brother. Not family. Just the next Grace preparing to kill. No further old man. The voice was familiar, smug, but Graham felt no fear. Fear was for those who still thought they had time. He didn't. I know what you did to her, Graham said. Thomas smiled in the dark. She was supposed to stay dead, and now you're here to finish the job. Thomas took a step forward. Only this time you're the job. Graham's hand tightened around the folder, the last proof of Evelyn's rightful inheritance. He wouldn't let Thomas take it. He couldn't. But then Thomas pulled something from his coat. Metal. Cold. A gun. No hesitation. Graham felt his pulse slow. He thought of Evelyn then, not the broken girl who came to him days ago, but the woman who walked back into the Grace estate, dripping river water, burning with fury. And he smiled. I knew you were your mother's son. Thomas's grin twisted. Wrong. He raised the gun. I'm worse. The gunshot never came, because Evelyn was faster. The sound of the engine roared into the alley as her car screeched to a stop, headlights flaring like the judgment Thomas never believed in. In the split second before he could fire, Evelyn was out of the car, running gravel slicing beneath her boots. She hit Thomas hard. No warning. No words. Just impact. The gun skittered across the pavement. Thomas hit the wall, stunned, before Evelyn's fist caught his jaw. Once. Twice. Her fury wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. "You tried to drown me!" Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a death sentence. Thomas spat blood, laughed. "You're supposed to be dead." Evelyn leaned closer. Surprise. She slammed his head against the wall once more, then let him fall. He crumpled, coughing, dazed, defeated. She didn't waste time. "Graham." The lawyer stood frozen at the edge of the alley, the folder still clutched to his chest like a lifeline. Evelyn grabbed his arm. "We have to go." Graham hesitated, looked down at Thomas, bleeding but alive. "You saved me." Evelyn didn't look back. "Don't make me regret it." They ran. The folder didn't fall. Later, when they reached the safe house, an old office Graham once kept for quiet conversations, he finally spoke. "I'll testify." Evelyn's head snapped up. "I'll swear before any court. I'll tell them what Allison did, what Thomas tried to do." His voice didn't shake. "I'll tell them who this estate belongs to." Evelyn watched him, the last man who'd stood beside her father, now standing beside her. She didn't thank him. Didn't need to. Because in war, loyalty doesn't need gratitude. It needs witnesses. And Graham had chosen his side. In the cold half-light of morning, the war shifted from shadows to paper. Evelyn stood hunched over Graham's office desk, her hands steady now as she pieced the last fragments of the will together. She'd worked through the night, ignoring the sting in her wrists, the burn behind her eyes. Ink bled across the scorched pages like veins pulling together a dead heart. But she wasn't reviving the past. She was weaponizing it. Done. Her voice cracked through the silence. Graham leaned over her shoulder, eyes narrowing at the fragile pages, their edges burnt, but the center hole, her father's signature, his handwriting, her name written beside words that changed everything. "Primary beneficiary Evelyn Grace. The real will." Graham's voice was tight. "We'll get it authenticated." "No." Evelyn's tone was sharper than she intended. She looked up, breathing hard. "We already did." He hesitated. Evelyn pulled a thin envelope from her coat pocket, the forensic report from the handwriting specialist she'd forced awake 3 hours earlier. She'd paid him double to keep silent. The signature, the ink, the dates, all confirmed legitimate. Graham met her gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Evelyn saw respect in his eyes. She wasn't her father's shadow anymore. She was the storm that followed. They moved fast after that. Graham coordinated the submission of the forensic report. Evelyn tracked down the private physician Dr. Ellis, the last name her father had circled in the margins of that hidden list. The conversation wasn't easy. At first, the man denied everything, claimed privacy, ethics. But Evelyn wasn't asking for consent. She was demanding the truth. When she placed 2 photographs on his desk, her father's bruised arms and the unlabeled vials, the doctor cracked. Slowly, painfully. But he confessed. He'd seen signs of poisoning. He'd noted the symptoms. But Allison had threatened his license, his family. "I told myself I couldn't help him." His voice shook. "I convinced myself he didn't want help." Evelyn's reply was cold. "You lied to him." He didn't deny it. She walked away with the documentation in hand. Toxicology suspicions. Medical notes. Enough to make the court listen. Meanwhile, across town, Allison moved just as quickly. She wasn't foolish enough to assume the rumors were wrong. Whispers of Evelyn's survival reached her ears by noon. Her first response wasn't fear. It was precision. She fired her current legal counsel, brought in Sharp, a defense attorney who made his reputation burying bodies inside loopholes. And then, without missing a breath, she reached out to her contacts, old favors, owed debts long held. 12 jurors decided verdicts. Allison needed only 2. 2 to buy. 2 to turn. 2 to ensure that no matter what Evelyn presented, the result was still a loss. Insurance, her specialty. In the game of survival, Allison Grace never bet on fairness. She bet on control. And this time she intended to win. Night came heavy. In Graham's office, Evelyn stood by the window, staring out at the dark like she could read Allison's next move from the shape of the streetlights. "Everything's ready," Graham said behind her. "No." Her voice was quiet. "Not yet." He frowned. "You've restored the will. You've got Ellis's testimony." Evelyn turned. Her voice wasn't tired. It was terrifying. "She's buying jurors." Graham's breath hitched. "You can't prove that." "I don't need to." Her voice dropped. "I need to make sure it doesn't matter." Graham shook his head. "You're talking about a court." Evelyn stepped closer, eyes burning. "I'm talking about my family." She didn't blink, which means nothing's fair. Silence stretched. Finally, Graham asked the question neither of them wanted to answer. "So what's your play?" Evelyn didn't look away. "Not survival." A pause. "Exposure." He understood then. The courtroom wasn't her battleground. It was her stage. The real trial wasn't for the judge. It was for the world. And Evelyn Grace wasn't coming for justice. She was coming for blood. And Allison. Allison didn't know it yet, but she'd already lost. The courthouse looked smaller than Evelyn remembered. Not physically, psychologically. Her childhood had painted this building as a fortress somewhere truth fought its final battles. But now, standing beneath the stone archway, she knew better. Justice wasn't waiting inside. Power was, and power always chose its side long before the verdict. Still, she walked through the doors. The cameras swarmed first. Reporters shoved microphones toward her, flashes, blinding voices overlapping. Ms. Grace. Is it true your stepmother attempted to dissolve your inheritance? Are you accusing Allison Grace of murder? Why come forward now after all these years? Evelyn said nothing. Her silence was her strategy. Behind her, Graham pushed forward, shielding her as best he could, but nothing could block the weight of public curiosity. In their eyes, Evelyn wasn't a person anymore. She was a headline. The heiress betrayed? Let them watch, Evelyn thought. Let them all watch. Inside the courtroom, the tension was worse. Not loud, silent, condensed. A kind of collective holding of breath. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded neatly back straight. Calm on the surface, rage underneath. Across from her sat Allison. Composed, elegant, and as the courtroom doors sealed shut, she played her opening move. She cried. Softly, convincingly. A master performance. Tears glimmered at the corners of her eyes, her voice trembling just enough as she addressed the judge. I tried to help Evelyn, she whispered, voice breaking at exactly the right syllable. She's been unstable since her father's death. She dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, her rings catching the light. None of this is her fault. Evelyn watched hollow. Allison continued, tone shifting toward pity. Losing a parent does that. Grief fractures reality, and when that happens, people lash out. They invent conspiracies. She paused, then dropped her final line smooth as silk. My stepdaughter is not my enemy. The courtroom stirred. Whispers curled like smoke through the gallery. Evelyn didn't react. Not outwardly, but inside something colder than hate took root. She waited. And when Allison finished her performance, the judge nodded toward the plaintiff's side. Ms. Grace. Evelyn rose. Her voice was steady. I have a document. The judge leaned forward. Its relevance. Evelyn didn't blink. It's the original will. Silence. Not confusion. Shock. Allison's composure cracked fractionally. Her fingers gripped the edge of the defense table just a little too tightly. Evelyn lifted the folder, walked forward. I submit this as authenticated evidence. The last will and testament of Orville Grace, my father. The clerk accepted it, hands trembling slightly. The judge read the first page, then the signature, then Evelyn's name. When he looked up, the courtroom wasn't breathing. Allison's tears had vanished. Evelyn watched her carefully, and then finally spoke. You told the world I was broken. She turned. You forgot I was listening. Allison didn't move. Couldn't. And for the first time since this war began, Evelyn smiled. Not from victory, from certainty. Because now the world wasn't watching Allison's performance. It was watching her fall. The courtroom didn't erupt all at once. It cracked slowly, one word at a time. Graham stood next to the projection screen, hands steady, despite the gravity of what he was about to say. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clear, direct, final. This isn't about inheritance. He let that hang. This is about murder. The judge straightened. The audience leaned forward. Allison didn't move. Graham clicked the first slide. A photograph filled the screen. Orville Grace's forearm, bruises spiraling like ink stains across thinning skin. His medical records followed fatigue, nausea, confusion. The symptoms Evelyn had once mistaken for age, for grief. They weren't. They were poison. Your Honor. Graham said calmly, our evidence indicates sustained exposure to small doses of anticoagulants administered without medical cause. This was not neglect. This was premeditated. The courtroom cracked louder now. Gasps. Whispers. One juror audibly cursed. Evelyn didn't blink. She kept her eyes on Allison, watching, waiting, but her stepmother's face remained unreadable. Graham continued, his voice colder now. Dr. Ellis's testimony confirms irregular blood panels unreported to Mr. Grace himself. Those test results were intercepted. Slide after slide, medical charts, suppressed toxicology reports, physician statements until Graham delivered the final strike. And the person listed as next of kin responsible for Mr. Grace's medical care? The pause was surgical. Ms. Allison Grace. Silence. Allison sat motionless. But Evelyn saw it, the faint tremble in her fingers, a hairline fracture behind the mask. Graham wasn't finished. He turned toward the projection screen again. This brings us to the financials. Another click. Transaction records exploded across the screen, each line a betrayal. Graham's voice hardened. 48 hours before Mr. Grace's death, over $3.4 million was transferred from his personal trust into an offshore account in Belize. He pivoted, eyes sharp. The authorization was not signed by Orville Grace. Evelyn stood slowly, her pulse ice. It was signed by Thomas Grace. The courtroom cracked wide open. Gasps, shouts, reporters scribbling furiously. Evelyn's voice sliced through them. I authenticated the signature myself. A murmur of confirmation from the forensic analyst seated behind her. Then chaos. Thomas leapt to his feet. You lying bitch. His scream ricocheted through the room, feral and uncontrolled. You forged that. You think this changes anything? The bailiff moved fast, but Thomas faster, until two guards tackled him before he reached Evelyn's table. The courtroom descended into noise. Chairs scraping. Voices overlapping. Thomas thrashing, spit flying as he roared. She was supposed to die. She was supposed to. The guards dragged him from the courtroom. His voice echoed long after he vanished. Silence like suffocation followed. Evelyn looked across the room. Allison hadn't moved. Not even when her son's voice broke on her name. The judge cleared his throat, voice shaking. Court will recess. Gavel slammed. Evelyn stood motionless, pulse finally slowing, knowing what Allison now knew. It was over. Not the trial. The lie. The facade was broken. And when the world looked at Allison Grace now, they wouldn't see a widow. They'd see a killer waiting her turn. The courtroom was quieter than Evelyn had ever known. No cameras. No voices. Just the judge's final words echoing off the marble walls like some kind of ending. The estate of Orville Grace is hereby restored to its rightful heir, Evelyn Grace. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like ashes. Evelyn stood slowly, her hands no longer fists, her voice no longer trembling. She looked at the judge, at the notaries, at Graham seated behind her. And then she said what no one expected. I decline. A pause stretched. The judge blinked. I'm sorry. Evelyn's voice was calm, unshaken. I refuse the inheritance. Shock rippled through the courtroom. Even Graham stirred, confused. Evelyn stepped forward, her tone steady. I request that the estate's full value be liquidated and transferred into a scholarship fund under the name of Orville Grace. The judge leaned forward, baffled. Miss Grace, do you understand what you're declining? Evelyn's answer was soft. I'm not declining. A pause. I'm healing. Silence swallowed the room. She continued. My father taught me that legacy isn't something you hold. It's something you leave behind. She met the judge's gaze. I'm leaving this. And that was it. No applause. No objection. Just the gavel falling like a final heartbeat. The courtroom emptied slowly after that. But Evelyn stayed. For a while. She stood in the center of the chamber as sunlight bled through stained glass windows, watching dust swirl in golden patterns around her like something sacred. She didn't feel like a winner. She felt free. By the next morning, the headlines ran everywhere. The heiress who walked away. Evelyn Grace, the girl who gave away a fortune. From courtroom to charity, the legacy of a daughter. The cameras still wanted her. Reporters called her name outside the estate gates. People wanted interviews, book deals, speaking tours. Evelyn said nothing. She walked past them all. Not because she didn't care, because she didn't need to explain. She'd buried the past, and she wasn't digging it up for anyone. The scholarship fund opened within weeks. Graham handled the logistics. He said she should name it after herself. She refused. It carried one name, Orville's Promise. For children who came from nothing. For those who never stood a chance. For every version of Evelyn who might have existed if her father hadn't taught her to fight. The money went fast. But it went right. Late one evening, she stood at the edge of the estate for the last time. The house loomed behind her. Silent. Empty. Not hers anymore. She didn't look back. Instead, she ran her fingers along the iron gate, breathing slow, steady, feeling the cold bite her skin one last time. Then she stepped through. And left. No goodbye. No ceremony. Only peace. That was victory. Not headlines. Not fortune. Silence. And for Evelyn Grace, silence was the only ending that mattered. The door creaked the way she remembered. Same hinges. Same weight. Same silence. Evelyn stepped into her childhood bedroom like someone entering a museum. Nothing had moved. Not the photographs on the wall. Not the cracked wooden dresser. Even the dust looked familiar, like time itself had been waiting for her return. She didn't rush. She crossed the room slowly, fingers brushing the faded wallpaper, the corner where she used to curl up after nightmares, the floorboard that creaked beneath bare feet during midnight, escapes to her father's study. But it wasn't those memories that stopped her. It was the drawer. She knelt in front of it, hesitated, then pulled. The old oak stuck for a second, then gave. Inside, just as she remembered, lay the scarf. Tiny, faded, worn thin from years of small hands clutching it during storms inside the house and inside herself. Her father's gift. Something to protect her. She picked it up carefully like it might dissolve. And then without thinking, she pressed it to her face. It no longer smelled like childhood. It smelled like endings. Evelyn sat on the floor, legs folded the way she used to as a girl's scarf tangled between her fingers, and for the first time since the verdict, she let the silence wrap around her, not as an enemy, as peace. Tears didn't come. Not now. Not anymore. She understood. This house wasn't her inheritance. It wasn't her burden. It wasn't even her home. It was a memory, and it was time to let it go. She stood folding the scarf neatly, precisely one last time. Then she placed it back in the drawer. She closed it and left it there. Outside, the estate stood still against the morning sky. Evelyn stood at the iron gates, breathing in the cold air, eyes locked on the windows of the house that once kept her safe, then trapped her. She saw ghosts now. Not Allison, not Thomas, not betrayal. She saw her father, laughing, teaching, forgiving, living. She let herself remember not the war, not the courtroom, not the inheritance. Just him. And for the first time she smiled. It wasn't victory. It wasn't healing. It was something simpler. Something quieter. Freedom. Her voice broke softly in the still air, not for anyone else. Just herself. Voiceover. The greatest legacy is learning how to let go. She turned and walked away. The gates didn't close behind her. They stayed open because she wasn't coming back. Not this time. The sun was already sinking when Evelyn reached the edge of the estate. The light had changed. Everything was gold now, quiet, heavy gold that washed over the iron gates and the overgrown path beyond. She didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. Nothing worth remembering. She carried no luggage, no documents, no proof. The only thing she carried now was breath, and that was enough. Her boots pressed against the gravel with each step forward. Slow, steady, deliberate. The road ahead curved toward the horizon like a question she no longer feared answering. Above her, the sky bled into a spectrum of amber and blue, the first stars flickering quietly like distant witnesses. She kept walking, not faster, not slower, just forward. Every inch of this land had once belonged to her father, and now it belonged to silence. Evelyn didn't mourn that. The war was over. She'd buried her ghosts without a funeral. No need for gravestones, no need for elegies. Let them fade. Let them vanish. Voiceover quiet, almost like memory itself. There are people who are born to betray. She stepped past the broken fence post near the old orchard. Images flashed behind her eyes. Allison's smile, Thomas's contempt, their voices twisting promises into lies, knives hidden in their words. Evelyn didn't hate them. Not anymore. Hate had weight. She'd dropped that too. Voiceover continued, colder now, sharper. But me? A pause as her boots hit the paved road. I was born to survive. And she believed it. With every heartbeat, every scar, every bruise that never showed, she kept walking, past the oak tree where her father once taught her how to climb, past the field where she first learned silence could protect her, past everything. The estate shrank behind her. Its windows no longer watched. Its walls no longer whispered. She was done listening. The gravel gave way to asphalt. The sound changed beneath her. Softer, cleaner. A new kind of silence. She walked toward the horizon. No destination. No ending. Just the next step. Above her, the sky burned violet. The wind pressed gentle fingers against her face. She didn't stop. Not when the last rays of sunlight shattered against the hills. Not when the moon took the sun's place. Not when the world behind her disappeared. Voiceover. One final time, softer now, less like a declaration and more like the truth. I thought my inheritance was a house. A pause. It wasn't. Another pause. It was myself. Her pace didn't change, fade out, but the sound of footsteps continued, long after the screen went black. Because Evelyn Grace was still walking, and this time no one could stop her.